They said I was ungrateful. But how would you feel if your dad forged your signature to save his pride, then blamed you when the house was taken away? I didn't yell. I didn't forgive. I just let the truth do the talking. 1 foreclosure, 3 voicemails, 97 missed calls later. Karma answered louder than I ever could. I'm Claire Monroe, and this is how I learned that if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The air outside smelled like cold rain and wood smoke when I crossed the Oregon border that Thursday night, Thanksgiving weekend 2023. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the kind of gray that makes you forget what sunlight looks like. I'd left San Diego before dawn, my car stuffed with work folders I would probably never touch, and a pie I had baked out of obligation more than excitement. I told myself I was going home for the holiday, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. 6 hours later, I stopped at a small roadside inn just outside Portland. The sign flickered. Vacancy, in weak red neon. Inside, the clerk handed me a key and smiled like he'd been rehearsing it for years. I carried my bag up to the second floor, dropped it on the bed, and stared at my phone. No calls, no messages from my parents, still nothing. I called my Aunt Ruth instead. "Hey, it's me," I said, trying to sound casual. Well, if it isn't my favorite niece. "Where are you hiding these days?" She laughed. "Actually, I'm in town. Thought I'd stop by if that's okay." "Of course it's okay. Come over, sweetheart. We've got leftovers and too much wine." Her house was the kind of warm that only old homes in Oregon could hold, thick with cinnamon roasted turkey and the soft hum of a fireplace. I walked in, greeted by the chatter of cousins I hadn't seen in years. Everyone looked relaxed, glowing in that post-holiday haze. My aunt handed me a glass of cider. "We were just talking about the Monroe dinner last night," she said, stirring the pot on the stove. "Your parents really outdid themselves this year. The place looked like something out of a magazine. For a moment I didn't understand." "Their dinner?" I asked. She looked at me puzzled. "Oh, didn't you see? They had a few people over, just family. Well, a small one, I guess." My stomach tightened. "Last night?" She nodded, oblivious. "Yep, your dad said it was nice to keep it simple. He even told me you were too busy with work to make the drive up." She laughed softly, turning back to the stove. "Honestly, can't blame him. You always were the busy bee." The words hit harder than I expected. I tried to swallow the cider, but it tasted too sweet. My fingers loosened around the glass, and for a second I thought I might drop it. I stared at the floor, at the shadows flickering across the old wood, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Too busy. I'd driven 6 hours to surprise them, and somehow they'd already celebrated without me. My aunt kept talking, unaware. "Your mom looked lovely. She wore that cranberry sweater she loves, the one with the little gold buttons. Oh, and that tree. Did you know she put it up early this year? Looked perfect right by the fireplace." I smiled weakly. "Yeah," I murmured. "I remember that tree." In my chest something cracked. The sound of laughter around me felt far away, muffled like I was underwater. Someone called my name, but I barely heard it. My aunt turned her brow furrowed. "You okay, honey?" I forced a nod. "Yeah, just tired from the drive." I slipped out before anyone could stop me stepping into the cold. The air stung my face. I got into the car and sat there for a long time, engine off, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Behind me, through the windshield, the warm glow of my aunt's house flickered. Shadows, moving, laughter spilling through the windows. Down the road, I could see my parents' street glowing with porch lights. My old house stood at the end, the same porch I used to sit on every summer night, the same driveway where Dad taught me how to change a tire. The curtains were drawn, but I could see silhouettes moving inside, my father's familiar posture near the kitchen island, my mother setting a plate on the counter. For a moment, I imagined knocking on the door. Imagined their surprise. Imagined them saying, "We were just about to call you." But they wouldn't. They hadn't. I started the engine but didn't drive. I just sat there, fingers trembling on the steering wheel, watching the house I used to call home. The lights inside blurred through my tears. I whispered into the empty car. "They forgot me," then shook my head, correcting myself, voice barely audible. "No, they decided to." The heater hummed softly. My phone screen lit up. Just the time, no new messages. I scrolled through my contacts anyway, stopping at Mom and Dad. The urge to call was almost physical. I imagined the conversation, my mother's polite surprise, my father's clipped tone, the excuses they'd offer, like small, neat bandages for a wound too deep to cover. Outside, wind swept through the tall pine trees, scattering the last of the autumn leaves across the road. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing slow, trying to steady the shaking. When I finally looked up again, the house was still glowing, the laughter faint through the night air. I pictured the table. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, the cranberry sauce recipe I'd emailed Mom last year. I could almost hear her saying, "It's just not Thanksgiving without Claire's touch." But maybe it was. Maybe it always had been. I sat there until the windows fogged, until the lights in the house went out one by one. Then I whispered to no one, "Maybe family isn't the place you're born into. Maybe it's just where you stop getting invited." The car heater clicked, and warm air filled the silence. My phone screen dimmed again, black and blank, reflecting only my own face. Tired eyes, stiff smile, the look of someone who finally understood her place. I didn't drive away yet. I just watched the house waiting for something, any small sign that they might remember. But the windows stayed dark. The porch light flickered once, then went out. The world outside was quiet. Inside the car, I whispered one last thing before turning the key. Sometimes home is just a place that forgot you existed. The rain started sometime after midnight, a fine mist tapping against the hotel window, like a quiet metronome. Portland always smelled like wet pine and regret. I thought, staring at the streaks of water crawling down the glass. The heater hummed weakly. My suitcase sat unopened in the corner, as if even it wasn't sure whether to stay or go. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen until my reflection blurred into the black. My thumb hovered over my mother's name. It had been weeks since we'd spoken, mostly text messages about bills or reminders to check the insurance payments, never about anything that mattered. I pressed call before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring. "Claire, honey." What a surprise. Her voice had that practiced brightness that meant she was performing. "Your father and I were just talking about you. We figured you'd be too busy down there in San Diego. I told him that girl never stops working. I'm not in San Diego," I said quietly. "I'm in Oregon." The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator hum behind her. Then a voice, my father's, called from somewhere nearby. "Who is it?" "It's Claire," she said, covering the receiver too late. His voice came clearer this time, clipped impatient. "Tell her not to drive in this weather. Roads are slick. We don't want her taking risks." I clenched my jaw. "There's no snow yet, Dad." A pause. "Claire," he said, his tone shifting into that calm, patronizing register he used at every argument. "Don't make a big deal out of this. It was just dinner. Just dinner. 9 years of paying their mortgage wiring money every month, buying gifts I never saw opened. And it was just dinner." I laughed softly, though it sounded more like a breath catching. "Right. Just dinner." "Sweetheart," my mother said quickly, voice trembling around the edges. "You know how things get around the holidays. So much to plan. It wasn't personal. It was always personal." "I have to go," I said, and hung up before she could finish the sentence. The room felt smaller after the call, like the walls had moved closer. I tossed the phone onto the bed and opened my laptop. The blue light washed over the white comforter. My banking app blinked awake. Cold numbers, tidy lines. Automatic payments. Mortgage $2,300. Electric $140. Pharmacy $62. Sophie's tuition $3,500. Each one tagged with the same memo recurring. The screen scrolled endlessly like a ledger of love that had never been reciprocated. I traced the cursor over the dates. The next payment was due in 3 days. Somewhere between rage and exhaustion, I whispered, "If I disappeared, would they even notice before the mortgage bounced?" The idea sat in the room with me, silent and heavy. Outside, headlights flashed across the wet pavement. Someone laughed in the hallway. I closed the laptop, the click loud in the quiet. My throat burned, but I refused to cry. I wasn't 12 years old anymore, waiting for an apology that would never come. I stood by the window, pressing my fingertips against the cold glass. The city lights shimmered, smeared by rain. Somewhere down that same road, my parents were probably asleep in the house I'd been helping them hold on to for almost a decade. The house, I thought, tied us together. Now it just felt like an anchor I poured a glass of tap water from the bathroom sink, took a sip, and set it down untouched. The taste of metal lingered on my tongue. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Eyes tired, mouth tense, shoulders hunched, as if carrying a weight that no one had ever acknowledged. When did I start mistaking obligation for affection? I picked up the hotel notepad and wrote without thinking. If I vanished tomorrow, would they miss me or the money? I tore the page off, folded it once, and slid it into my wallet. A keepsake of clarity. The rain softened outside. I turned off the lamp and let the dark fill the room. My mind replayed my father's words, sharp and dismissive. Don't make a big deal out of this. He said it the same way he'd said it when I cried after my first breakup, or when I told him I didn't want to major in accounting, but did it anyway to make him proud. Everything small enough to dismiss, never big enough to matter. My mother's voice floated through the memory next. Your father means well. The same excuse she'd offered all my life, and somehow it had always been enough to make me forgive them both. But tonight it didn't soothe. It stung. I grabbed my phone again, scrolled to my sister's number, and stared at it. Sophie was 22 now, living on the money I wired every semester, blissfully unaware of the bills attached to her comfort. She'd posted a Thanksgiving photo the night before, our parents smiling behind her, the table gleaming with candles. I had scrolled past it without realizing what I was seeing. Now I saw everything. The rain slowed to a drizzle. I cracked the window open, letting the cold air in until the heater whirred louder to compensate. I sat by the edge of the bed, hugging my knees, breathing through the ache in my chest. I wanted to scream, to call them back, to demand an explanation, but I knew exactly what they'd say. We didn't mean to hurt you, sweetheart. You work so hard. We thought it'd be easier this way. Easier for them, maybe. Never for me. I reached for the notebook on the nightstand, my budgeting notebook, the one filled with lists of numbers and neat notes about deadlines. On the first empty page, I wrote in slow, deliberate letters, "If I stop paying, what happens?" Then underlined it twice. The question didn't scare me as much as it should have. I closed the notebook, lay back on the bed, and listened to the hum of the city outside. Somewhere below, a car passed through a puddle, sending a spray against the curb. I pictured the water splashing, spreading wide, then settling again, messy but cleansing. When I finally drifted toward sleep, the last thing I thought wasn't about family or forgiveness. It was about silence. The kind that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion so deep that even the pain runs out of things to say. The next morning smelled like burnt espresso and rain. The cafe below the hotel was nearly empty, just the low hum of a coffee grinder and the muffled chatter of 2 students by the window. I ordered a black coffee and sat in the corner where the light from the gray Portland sky filtered through streaked glass. My laptop screen came to life with a soft blue glow. I hesitated before logging in. 9 years, $220,000. That was the total number sitting in my transaction history. Every transfer neatly categorized: mortgage, utilities, prescriptions, tuition. Each month perfectly on time like clockwork. I scrolled through line after line, watching the years blur together. Mortgage $2,300, electricity $145, pharmacy $62, tuition $3 $500. Again, and again, and again. I felt my chest tighten as I clicked through the oldest records. 2014, the year Dad retired early, the year I started helping out. Back then it had felt noble, generous even. I remembered calling him that first month, proud of myself. I set up the auto pay for the mortgage, I'd said. He'd laughed, a short, easy sound. That's my girl. He never asked if it was too much. I never told him it was. The barista slid my cup onto the counter, breaking my trance. I took a sip, bitter and too hot, then set it down again. I scrolled faster. 9 years of quiet obedience, of filling in the gaps no one acknowledged. My parents' life, comfortable, stable, immaculate. Funded by the daughter they'd forgotten to invite to dinner. A notification blinked in the corner of the screen. A new text. Happy Thanksgiving, Claire. Sophie. My heart clenched before I could stop it. Sophie, my sister 22, always bright, always oblivious. The one I swore I'd protect. I typed back, you too. Soph, hope you had a good one. I stared at the message for a full minute before deleting it. Some things didn't deserve an answer, even if the silence hurt. I closed the laptop, finished the coffee, and walked out into the drizzle. The air smelled faintly of cedar and wet asphalt. Portland was waking up around me. Buses groaning, shopkeepers unlocking doors, joggers cutting through puddles. Everyone moving forward while I stood still trapped in the arithmetic of my own generosity. By noon, I was already on I-5 heading south toward San Diego. The miles rolled by in muted blues and greens, a blur of evergreen and overcast sky. The farther I drove, the lighter the landscape felt, but the heavier my chest became. When I reached home, the sun was already setting behind the skyline. The office building for West Shore Capital loomed across the street from my apartment, its mirrored windows reflecting the orange light. I'd spent almost 10 years there, climbing from junior accountant to lead analyst, fixing other people's financial messes while quietly drowning in my own. The next morning, I was back at my desk before anyone else. The office was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. My colleagues would trickle in later, still glowing from family dinners, carrying leftover pies and stories about chaos and laughter. I had none of those. I had spreadsheets. I opened the quarterly reports and started reconciling numbers, my fingers moving automatically over the keyboard. I didn't hear Callahan approach until he spoke. "You're in early," he said, setting his coffee on the edge of my desk. "You planning to take any time off this week?" I smiled without looking up. "No, I've got month-end closeouts to finish." He studied me for a moment. "Claire, you haven't taken a real vacation in what, 3 years?" "4," I corrected, glancing at the monitor. He nodded slowly. "Well, that explains a lot." He started to walk away, then stopped. "You know, working yourself to death doesn't make people love you more. It just makes them expect more from you." I didn't answer. When the elevator doors closed behind him, I exhaled long and shaky. He was right, but I wasn't ready to hear it. The hum of the office returned, printers warming up, keyboards tapping. I stared at the rows of numbers on my screen, but all I saw was my parents' mortgage statement. The figures blurred into each other, forming a pattern I couldn't unsee. How many times had I told myself it was fine, that this was what family did? I'd justified every payment, every sacrifice. Dad needed help with the bills. Mom's back surgery had drained their savings. Sophie's tuition couldn't wait. There was always a reason, always something urgent. And I, the reliable one, the good daughter, never questioned it. But last night the truth had arrived. Quiet, sharp, undeniable. They didn't forget to invite me. They simply didn't think they had to. I wasn't family anymore. I was function. I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling's sterile white tiles. My reflection in the monitor caught my eye. A woman in her mid-30s, hair pulled back too tight. Lipstick worn off, looking like someone who kept everything together while quietly falling apart. Lunch hour came and went. I stayed put, eating almonds from my drawer, scrolling through expense reports. The office around me buzzed with laughter as coworkers swapped stories, mothers-in-law turkey disasters, endless travel delays. When someone asked about my holiday, I smiled and said, "Quiet," and left it at that. Later, when the building emptied, and only the janitor's vacuum echoed down the hall, I opened my email again. My mother had sent me a link, tips for financial balance in stressful times. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. The city outside glowed with evening lights. Through the glass, I could see couples walking arm in arm, the faint reflection of Christmas decorations starting to appear in storefronts. I thought about the house in Oregon, the one I'd paid for, but no longer belonged to, and wondered if the tree was already up, if they'd reused the ornaments I'd mailed them last year. I powered down my computer and gathered my things. The office was quiet again, the way I liked it. As I locked the door, a thought flickered uninvited, but clear. Working myself to the bone never made me indispensable. It just made me invisible. In the elevator, I caught my reflection one more time in the mirrored walls. I looked composed, efficient, unbothered. But underneath, something small and cold had started to shift. A realization I couldn't yet name, only feel. When I stepped out into the night, the air was sharp and clean. For once, I didn't rush home. I walked slowly, letting the silence of the empty street wrap around me like a question I was finally ready to ask. What would happen if I stopped holding everything together? The wind picked up, carrying the smell of the ocean. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm went off, then stopped. I kept walking until the noise faded, until all I could hear was my own heartbeat, steady and tired. The week after Thanksgiving felt endless. The office lights at West Shore Capital were too bright, the kind that made your eyes ache by noon. Files piled up on my desk like snowdrifts, deadlines stacked on top of one another. I tried to lose myself in the numbers the way I always did when I didn't want to think. By Tuesday morning, I'd been in the office since before sunrise. The white noise of printers and keyboards surrounded me, sterile and safe. Then Callahan, my boss, knocked on the glass of my cubicle. Got a minute. In his office, the blinds were half closed, cutting lines of light across the floor. He leaned against his desk, coffee mug in hand. "You've been running at 100 miles an hour lately," he said. "And I don't mean that as a compliment." "I'm fine," I replied automatically. He smiled in that way older men do when they don't believe you but don't want to argue. "Claire, you're good. Maybe too good. But you look tired. Take a weekend off. Do something that's not balancing everyone else's books." I nodded, pretending I'd consider it. When I stepped out, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Oregon area code. "Hello?" A woman's voice came through, polite and calm. "Hi, this is Evelyn Brooks with Bay West Mortgage. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. We're updating our files and need to confirm a few details regarding your refinancing from 2020. My pen froze midair. Refinancing. Yes, ma'am. The property on Meadowlark Drive in Lake Oswego. You're listed as a co-signer. I stood up my chair, rolling back. I think you have the wrong person. I didn't refinance anything. There was a pause, papers rustling on her end. Perhaps a misunderstanding. It's under your name and social security number. Would you like me to email you the document we have on file? Please do. I said, my throat tight. Within seconds, the email arrived. I opened it and stared at the attached PDF. There it was, my name printed neatly at the bottom of a loan agreement, and above it, my signature. Or almost my signature. The first and last name were perfect, but the middle initial was wrong. It was too round, too deliberate. A forgery that knew me well enough to mimic me, but not enough to get it right. My pulse quickened. "I didn't sign this," I whispered. Evelyn's voice softened. "If that's the case, Ms. Monroe, I'd recommend contacting our fraud department. They'll walk you through the steps. Who filed this originally?" She hesitated. "Robert Monroe. He's listed as the primary applicant." The room tilted. "That's my father," I said, though I wasn't sure if she heard me. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking. The memory hit me so suddenly it made my stomach twist. Dad at the kitchen table 2 years ago, stacks of papers spread out in front of him. "Can you sign this real quick, kiddo? Just helping with the car insurance." I'd signed without reading. He'd smiled, patted my hand, and said, "You make everything easier." Now I realized what he'd meant. By the time I left the office, the sun had already set. I drove aimlessly through the city headlights, reflecting off wet asphalt. San Diego's coastline shimmered in the distance, dark waves licking at the rocks. I parked near the beach and stepped out. The air was cool and salty. The sky streaked with violet. I walked along the boardwalk, shoes clicking against the wood, every step syncing with my heartbeat. The phone in my pocket felt heavier than usual. I wanted to call him, demand an explanation, scream anything, but I didn't. I already knew what he'd say. He'd sound calm, logical, maybe even annoyed that I'd misunderstood. He'd tell me he needed to protect the house, that it was temporary, that he'd planned to pay it back. He'd tell me I should be grateful to be part of something bigger than myself. He'd make it sound like love. I sat on a bench overlooking the ocean. A couple passed by, laughing, the woman's scarf whipping in the wind. Somewhere behind me, a man was playing guitar, softly, singing a half-forgotten tune. The sound should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I opened the email again, staring at my name. The numbers blurred. 75,000, 12-year term interest rate, 4.8%. Cold, impersonal lines tying me to a debt I never agreed to. The waves crashed against the shore, white foam curling like claws. I whispered to the wind. He used my name. I thought about all the years I'd spent defending him to friends, to myself. The jokes I made about his pride, his stubbornness. The way I'd once believed that being needed was the same as being loved. I pressed my palms together, trying to steady my breath. For years I'd told myself that I was sacrificing for family, that the money, the patience, the forgiveness were proof of loyalty. But tonight, sitting there with salt on my skin and a forged signature glowing on my phone, I finally saw it for what it was. It wasn't sacrifice. It was convenience. He hadn't needed my help. He'd needed my name. A gust of wind blew harder, sending sand against my shoes. I stood and faced the water, the horizon blurred between dark ocean and darker sky, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel connected to anything. No home, no duty, no anchor, just the hollow echo of something breaking loose. Behind me, the guitar stopped. The silence that followed was sharp final. I whispered to no one I thought I was saving them, but maybe they were just using me. The waves answered with another crash, and I stood there until my fingers went numb, until I couldn't tell if the sting on my face was from the cold wind or from tears I refused to shed. The sky over Portland was a flat, pale gray when my plane touched down, the kind of morning where everything felt half asleep, the fog curling low around the tarmac. I moved through the terminal with my carry-on in one hand and a folder in the other. The loan documents Evelyn had sent. My stomach had been in knots since I left San Diego, and not even the bitter airport coffee could untangle them. By the time I reached Bay West Mortgage downtown, the air had turned to drizzle. The building smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. Evelyn Brooks was waiting for me in the lobby, a petite woman in a navy suit, the kind of polite efficiency that made you feel both comforted and interrogated. She led me into a small office where a manila folder sat neatly on the desk. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Monroe," she said, folding her hands. "I understand this has been unexpected," I nodded, setting my purse down beside me. "You could say that." She opened the folder, sliding a stack of papers toward me. "This is the original refinancing file from June 2020. You're listed as a co-signer. The primary applicant, Robert Monroe, submitted these in person." I stared at the name, then at the signature that wasn't mine. It looked back at me, confident practiced. Did he say why he needed the loan? "According to his application home improvements, he mentioned your financial background as reassurance to the bank." I almost laughed. He always knew how to make a lie sound like responsibility. Evelyn hesitated. "Would you like to file a fraud report?" I shook my head slowly. "Not yet." She nodded, perhaps out of understanding, perhaps relief. As I gathered the papers, she added softly, "If you need advice, I can connect you to someone who handles this sort of thing. Financial abuse cases." The words hung in the air. Abuse sounded too heavy, too dramatic, but it settled somewhere deep anyway. I thanked her and left. Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain. My rental car smelled faintly of pine air freshener. I drove toward Lake Oswego past rows of bare trees and quiet neighborhoods where Christmas wreaths already hung on doorways. When I turned onto my parents' street, the sight hit harder than I expected. The house looked smaller than I remembered. 2 stories, white siding shutters faded from years of rain. Leaves blanketed the front yard, damp and clinging to the path. The curtains in the front window were half drawn, the porch light still on, even though it was mid-morning. I parked at the curb engine, idling. My hand hovered over the keys, but I forced myself to get out. The steps creaked as I climbed them. I knocked once. No answer. Knocked again louder. Still nothing. The door wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. Dad had always said we've got nothing worth stealing. Inside the house smelled stale, a mix of cold coffee and old food. The dining table still held dirty plates, bits of turkey, and congealed gravy clinging to them. A half-empty wine bottle leaned precariously near the edge. The same table where I'd spent every Thanksgiving until they stopped expecting me. "Hello?" My voice sounded foreign in the silence. The television murmured faintly from the living room. I followed the sound. Dad was there, sitting in his recliner, remote in hand, eyes fixed on the screen, like he'd been waiting for something to distract him. His hair looked thinner, his sweater frayed at the sleeves. He didn't look up. "What are you doing here?" My throat felt dry. "I came to ask why you used my name to take out a loan." His finger hovered over the remote. "Don't start. Don't start," I repeated. "You forged my signature, Dad. You used my credit to cover your debt." He finally looked at me, then the calm, sharp look I knew too well. "Watch your tone. I didn't forge anything. I handled what needed handling. That house doesn't pay for itself." My heart hammered against my ribs. "You handled it by lying." He stood now slower than I remembered, but still with that same controlled presence. "Everything I've ever done was for this family. For your mother, for Sophie, for you. You think any of this was easy? Keeping things afloat?" "Easy," I said, laughing under my breath. "You made it easy for yourself. You let me do the work while you kept your pride." He frowned, the corners of his mouth tightening. "You're being dramatic." The word landed like a slap. He'd used it my whole life, to shrink my anger, to make my pain sound childish. Behind him, Mom appeared in the doorway, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder. "Claire," she said softly. "Please, your father's just been under pressure. He didn't mean what I turned to her. Didn't mean to use my name, didn't mean to pretend everything was fine while letting me pay for it." She took a step forward. "He was scared, honey. The bills, the mortgage, no." I said quietly. "He was scared of losing his image. That's all." Dad opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "You could have asked me. You could have told me the truth. But you didn't. You decided my trust was something you could spend like everything else." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. The only sound was the TV, a commercial for holiday sales, blaring absurdly cheerful music. Mom's voice broke first. "Don't do this here, please." I looked at her, then at him, two people who'd built a life out of appearances and convenience, and realized there was nothing left to salvage. "I'm done," I said. I turned, walked to the door, and stepped out into the rain. The air hit me like a slap. Cold, clean, real. I closed the car door harder than I meant to, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Through the windshield, I could still see the faint glow of the TV inside the house flickering across the window like a ghost of everything I used to believe in. As I pulled away, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. For the first time in my life, I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I just drove, rain streaking across the glass, the city fading behind me. That was the day I realized silence could be louder than any argument. And for once, I let it speak for me. San Diego's rain was the quiet kind, the kind that blurred streetlights into long, golden streaks and made the city look softer than it really was. The cafe on the corner of Fifth Avenue smelled like espresso and wet wool. I sat by the window coat draped over the chair, watching the reflections of people rushing by under umbrellas. Across from me, David Chen flipped through the papers I'd handed him. His brow furrowed in that way only lawyers manage, the kind that says they already know what you're about to ask, but want you to say it anyway. He tapped the page with a pen. "You've been paying their mortgage for how long? 9 years?" I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "It started as a temporary thing. My dad said he'd take it back once his retirement funds stabilized. And he refinanced without your consent 2 years ago." "Yes." David leaned back, exhaling. "If you stop paying, the bank will repossess the house. They'll contact your father directly since he's the primary borrower. You're not legally required to cover anything unless you signed other documents, which from what you've shown me you didn't." I stirred my coffee, watching the swirl of cream dissolve into the dark. "So if I walk away, it's him they'll come after." He nodded. "That's how contracts work." "You've been holding up something that isn't yours to carry." The sentence hung between us, heavier than I expected. "I don't want revenge," I said quietly. David looked at me for a long moment before answering. "This isn't revenge, Claire. It's boundaries. There's a difference." He closed the folder and pushed it toward me. "You've been his safety net for too long. People forget how to stand when you never let them fall." Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the bay. I stared past him at the rain threading down the window and said, almost to myself, "I thought that's what love was, keeping everyone safe." "Love without respect isn't love," he said. "It's obligation, and obligation will drain you faster than hate ever could." He said it so matter-of-factly that it almost made me laugh. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that isn't uncomfortable but final. When I left, he stood to hug me. "Whatever happens next," he said, "don't apologize for protecting yourself." The air outside smelled like rain and gasoline. I walked to my car, pulling my coat tighter. The city lights smearing across the windshield as I drove home. The sound of the wipers kept rhythm with my thoughts, steady, deliberate, inevitable. By the time I reached my apartment, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Inside, everything looked exactly as I'd left it, the half-read book on the coffee table, the dishes in the sink, the framed photo of Sophie on the shelf, smiling in her graduation gown. I set my keys down, kicked off my shoes, and sat at my desk. The laptop screen lit up the room in pale blue. I opened my bank account. Rows of automatic payments stared back at me like quiet witnesses. Mortgage, $2,300. Utilities, $145. Prescriptions, $62. Tuition, $3,500. I moved the cursor to the first one. Click. A small window appeared, cancel auto payment. My finger hovered over the mouse. For years, that click had been reflex, something I did without thinking, like breathing. I thought of my father sitting in that recliner, eyes glued to the TV, voice flat, when he said, "Don't start." I thought of my mother, soft-voiced and apologetic, covering for him. I thought of Sophie, blissfully unaware that her comfort came with a cost. I clicked confirm. Mortgage. Cancelled. The screen blinked, then refreshed. Utilities. Cancelled. Prescriptions. Cancelled. Tuition. Cancelled. The last click echoed in the quiet room. I leaned back, heart pounding. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release, sharp and unfamiliar. I reached for my notebook, the same one I used for budgets and deadlines. On the next clean page, I wrote slowly, December 5th, 2023. End of obligation. The words looked too neat, too small for what they meant. I sat for a while staring at them, the rain outside tapping a steady rhythm against the glass. For a moment, guilt fluttered through me, a small, stubborn reflex. I pushed it away. For 9 years, I'd kept them safe. I'd taken pride in it even. I'd called it love, responsibility, devotion. But none of it had been mutual. It was maintenance, not affection. And now I was done maintaining something that only drained me. The heater clicked on. Warm air filled the apartment, but my hands were still cold. I closed the notebook and placed it on the desk. On the computer screen, a small notification popped up. Auto payments disabled. I whispered the words aloud, testing how they sounded. They felt strange in my mouth. Final, but right. For the first time in years, I felt something close to calm. Not happiness, not yet, but space. Space to breathe, to think without someone else's name attached to every decision. I walked to the window and looked out over the city. The rain had stopped, but everything still glistened under the streetlights. The pavement, the parked cars, even the leaves clinging to the trees. A couple crossed the street laughing under one umbrella. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed, then faded. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and closed my eyes. For so long, I'd confused love with debt, care with servitude. I thought keeping them from falling apart was proof that I mattered, but all it had ever done was teach them I'd never say no. Now, I finally had. When I opened my eyes, the reflection staring back wasn't the exhausted woman I'd seen the night before. She looked the same, maybe, but something behind her eyes had shifted. Steady, almost defiant. I turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow from the laptop screen. The words, "Auto payments disabled," were still there, small but undeniable. I took one last breath before shutting the lid, letting the darkness fill the room. It was strange the way peace could feel so much like fear at first, but beneath the unease, there was a quiet certainty that wouldn't go away. I wasn't saving them anymore. I was saving myself. 2 weeks passed before the first ripple reached me. December had settled in over Portland, cold and gray, the kind of winter that made everything look like an old photograph. I imagined the letter arriving that morning. Thin paper Bay West mortgage stamped across the top in blue ink, the kind of envelope that carried weight no one wanted to touch. I didn't have to imagine my father's reaction. I knew it by heart. He'd open it at the kitchen table, the same table I'd once eaten breakfast at before school, his glasses sliding down his nose. He'd mutter something to himself, something like, "This must be a mistake," then fold the letter too neatly, too calmly, because men like him didn't crumble. Not yet. That evening my phone rang. "Claire." My mother's voice sounded like she was trying to keep the panic from leaking through. "Your father got a notice from the bank. Something about missed payments. Maybe they sent it to you by mistake." I stared out the window, the San Diego skyline shimmering faintly through drizzle. "They didn't make a mistake, Mom." A pause. "What do you mean?" "It's not an error," I said quietly. "I stopped the payments." She inhaled sharply. "Claire, I can't talk right now." I hung up before her voice could turn pleading. 3 days later he called. Once. Then again. Then again. At first, his messages were clipped polite. "Hey, kiddo, think there's a problem with the bank. Call me back." By the 5th, his tone sharpened. I don't know what game you're playing, Claire, but this isn't funny. By the 10th, he sounded smaller. Claire, please, just call me. We can fix this. I didn't answer. I turned the phone face down on the table and let it buzz against the wood until it stopped. That same afternoon, Sophie called. Her name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I almost didn't pick up. But old habits die hard. Hey, I said. Something's wrong, she blurted. Her voice trembled. The school says my tuition payment didn't go through. They emailed me a warning. I closed my eyes. That's right. When I stopped paying, there was silence, just the faint sound of her breathing through the phone, then softly. Why would you do that? Because it's not my responsibility. Soph, it never was, but you always, I know I interrupted, and that's the problem. Her voice cracked. You can't just stop. Mom said you were just stressed that you didn't mean it. You always help us. I'm not helping this time. The line went quiet, and then I heard the small sound of her crying before she hung up. After that, the messages came faster. Calls from Mom. Dad, even numbers I didn't recognize. I muted them all. My apartment filled with the echo of unanswered noise, vibrations from my phone rattling against the counter, the sharp chime of voicemails stacking up. By the second week of December, I'd stopped checking entirely. Still, the sound followed me, at work, in the car, even in the shower, like guilt had found a ringtone it liked. That Friday night, I came home to a quiet that felt heavier than silence. The rain outside had turned steady, brushing against the windows in rhythmic taps. I poured a glass of wine I didn't want and sat by the window watching the city blur into streaks of light. My phone lay on the table screen, glowing with missed calls. I counted them once, then again, as if the number itself mattered. 97, 15 voicemails. I picked it up and scrolled through the list. Daddle, Mom, Dad, Sophie, unknown dad. Again. The same sequence, like they were passing the phone back and forth in desperation. I pressed play on the most recent voicemail. My father's voice filled the room, shaky but still trying to sound composed. Claire, it's your father. We got another notice today. They said they'll escalate if we don't resolve it soon. You must have forgotten to update something. Just call me. We can fix this. Please. The next one was shorter. Claire, this is serious. Don't do this. The one after that was barely more than a whisper. I don't know what to say to your mother anymore. I stopped listening. I set the phone down, screen up this time, watching the glow dim to black. The sound of rain filled the space where their voices had been. For years, silence had been my punishment. What they gave me when I disappointed them, when I didn't conform. Now it was my weapon. My refuge. I whispered to the dark. You never heard me when I spoke. Maybe now you'll listen. The words startled me. I hadn't meant to say them aloud. But once I did, they felt true. The next call came minutes later. I didn't move to answer. The vibration against the wood hummed steady, then stopped. The room fell quiet again, except for the rain, steady and insistent. I thought I'd feel guilty. I thought the relief would come later, after the storm of calls subsided, but sitting there, surrounded by all that noise, fading into nothing, I felt something strange instead. Weightless, almost detached. It wasn't joy. It wasn't peace. It was the space between both, a suspended breath that said, maybe I was free. The rain eased outside, slowing to a mist. I stood and opened the window. Cold air rushed in sharp against my skin. From somewhere down the block I could hear the faint hum of a passing train, a sound that used to comfort me as a child. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle again. 97 missed calls, 15 voicemails, a lifetime of noise that finally meant nothing. They had spent years speaking over me, around me, about me, but never to me. Now my silence was the only thing left they couldn't control. I leaned against the windowsill, exhaling slow. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I was lonely or liberated. Maybe both. Maybe that's what freedom sounded like. The ringing that finally stopped. The first pictures appeared online before the news reached me. A moving truck parked in front of my parents' house, a line of cardboard boxes stacked on the curb, the porch light still burning in the middle of the day. The caption under the photo read, "Sad to see the Monroes leave." They were such a nice family. It was posted by Lisa Hart, the neighbor who once brought us pies every Christmas. 53 likes, a dozen comments, half sympathetic, half curious. By the time I saw it, the story had already made its way through Lake Oswego. A short article in the Oregon Daily Chronicle. Local engineer Robert Monroe faces foreclosure after years of success. Sources close to the family cite personal financial difficulties. The words were polite, almost kind. The way small towns wrap scandal in gentle language. I sat at my desk in San Diego, staring at the screen. The hum of the office around me felt distant, muffled. Outside the glass walls, my coworkers moved like ghosts, smiling, talking, planning lunch. I couldn't hear a thing they said. The next photo showed the front door wide open, movers carrying out furniture I'd grown up with. The old sofa Mom refused to replace the oak dining table where Dad insisted we eat every meal together. The house looked hollow, exposed. In Oregon, the whispers had already spread beyond the street. At St. Paul's Church, where my parents had attended for 20 years, Pastor Mike began the Sunday service with an extra prayer. "Let us ask God to give strength to those facing hardship," he said. His eyes lingered on my mother's pew, and courage to face the truth. Mom sat in the second row, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the silence behind her the way the congregation avoided eye contact. After the service, no one stopped to chat. No one asked about her garden, or her back pain, or the new curtains she'd hung just last month. When she came home, she found Dad in the kitchen, surrounded by boxes, the mortgage letter spread open on the counter. The notice was blunt. Property to be vacated within 14 days. He slammed his fist on the table. "This is her fault," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "That girl wanted to destroy me." Mom flinched at the sound. "Robert, stop," she said softly. "We can't keep pretending. She could have fixed this with one phone call," he shouted. "One call," Linda's voice cracked. "We've been hiding the truth for years. Maybe it's time it caught up to us." He turned on her, then his face red. "You think this is my fault? You let her believe she was part of this family. You encouraged it." Mom didn't answer. She picked up the letter, folded it neatly, and left the room. That night, Sophie came home from campus to pack the last of her things. The house was colder than she remembered, the walls stripped bare where family photos used to hang. She found Mom sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an empty mug. "Where's Dad?" Sophie asked. In the garage, her mother whispered, trying to find something to blame. Sophie hesitated, then asked the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. Did he really use Claire's name, Linda? Looked up, eyes wet. "Yes." Sophie swallowed hard, pulled out her phone and typed a message. "I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't know Dad did that. When the message reached me, I was still in the office. I read it once, twice, my vision blurring slightly. My inbox pinged again. A new email from David Chen. Subject update, Monroe account. "Hi, Claire, just a quick note to confirm that Bay West has officially removed your name from the loan record. You are not legally responsible for any outstanding debt or property issues. The account will default solely under Robert Monroe." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Around me, the world carried on. The phones ringing, the copy machine humming, the elevator chiming every few minutes. On my monitor, the email glowed like a verdict, not legally responsible. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence. I clicked out of the window and looked at Sophie's message again. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure what to say. "It's okay" seemed false. "I forgive you" felt premature. So I wrote nothing at all. The rain started again outside, tapping gently against the glass. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at the sound. I imagined my parents' house. Its empty rooms, the faint echo of footsteps, the way the walls must have sounded without furniture to absorb the noise. I thought of Mom sitting at that table, hearing the neighbors whisper, of Dad clutching his pride like a lifeline, refusing to see that the thing collapsing around him wasn't just a house. It was the illusion he'd built to keep himself from feeling small. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You did this to yourself." The words weren't cruel. They were simply true. When I opened them again, the office lights flickered off for the night, leaving only the glow of my computer. I gathered my things and stepped outside. The rain had softened to a mist, and the city smelled of wet concrete and eucalyptus. As I walked to my car, I checked my phone one more time. The unread messages had stopped. No calls, no voicemails, no new excuses. Just quiet. And for the first time, I didn't need to explain myself. When the truth finally stands on its own, You don't have to defend it. It speaks loud enough without you. A month after the house was gone, winter settled hard over Oregon. The kind of cold that seeps into walls, into bones, into the quiet between people who no longer know what to say to each other. My parents had moved into a small, rented apartment in Beaverton, a 2-bedroom with beige carpets and a view of the parking lot. I didn't see it in person, but I could picture it perfectly. My father pacing the narrow living room, his slippers dragging against the cheap laminate floor. My mother kneeling beside an open box, folding memories into cardboard. The framed wedding photo, Sophie's high school diploma, the seashell I'd brought home from Santa Cruz when I was 10. She'd pack each one gently, as if handling something fragile, though none of it had any value anymore. The furniture didn't fit right in the new place. The old oak table was too big for the kitchen, the couch too worn for the space. Everything they owned looked out of place, as if it belonged to a life that had already ended. Mom told Sophie once, "Your father walks like he's waiting for someone to forgive him." Sophie didn't know how to answer, so she just kept washing dishes at the cafe, where she'd started working part-time. The sink water steamed in front of her as she scrubbed a coffee mug, her phone buzzing beside her with another notification. Past due balance. Tuition account suspended. She stared at it for a long time before setting it face down on the counter. Meanwhile, in San Diego, I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through the morning headlines. My eyes caught on one line that stopped me cold. Bay West Mortgage finalizes foreclosure on Monroe residence. There it was. Final. Clean. No speculation. No polite phrasing. Just the truth laid out in black and white. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the silence fill the room. The sunlight spilled across the floor, catching on the rim of my coffee cup. It should have felt like vindication, but all I felt was stillness, like the world had stopped holding its breath. The text came a few minutes later. My phone buzzed once, twice. I didn't need to check the number to know it was him. I did everything for this family. "You've destroyed me." I stared at the message, reading it slowly. The words were sharp, familiar, heavy with the same self-pity I'd spent years translating into guilt. My thumb hovered above the keyboard before I finally typed back. "You didn't do it for the family, Dad. You did it for your pride." I hit send, then blocked the number. The screen went dark, and the room felt strangely peaceful. Only the faint hum of music from the speaker broke the quiet, a soft jazz tune I'd left playing on repeat. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city below my apartment glimmered with evening lights blurred by mist. For the first time, I didn't feel tethered to the chaos miles away. It was still happening, my father's anger, my mother's apologies, Sophie's confusion. But it no longer pulled me under. I walked to the window and leaned my forehead against the glass. A group of people crossed the street below, laughing, carrying takeout bags and paper cups of coffee. Life moved on. It always did. I thought about him sitting in that apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes, waiting for a phone call that would never come. I thought about Mom, too, still defending him even when there was nothing left to defend. I thought about the years I'd spent believing I could fix what they broke, mistaking silence for peace, obedience for love. I didn't feel angry anymore, just tired. Tired in a way that reached my bones but didn't hurt. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes when you finally stop running towards something that was never yours to catch. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat back down. The steam rose in thin curls, soft and slow. On the counter beside me, a small stack of unopened mail waited, bills, catalogs. A holiday card from a coworker who didn't know I no longer celebrated much of anything. My laptop screen blinked awake again, and David's name appeared at the top of a new email. Claire just confirming. Bay West has cleared your name from all obligations. You're fully released from liability. No further action is needed. I read it twice, then let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. It was done. The strange thing about justice is how quiet it is when it finally arrives. No thunder, no applause. Just the slow unraveling of lies that no longer have anywhere to hide. I closed the laptop, the click echoing softly in the still room. For a long time, I sat there, letting the quiet stretch. I used to think fairness had to be fought for, that someone had to shout to prove to demand it, but now I knew better. Truth doesn't need an audience. It just waits for its moment to stand. Outside, the sky turned gold, then gray again. I opened the window, letting in the chill. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, the sound fading quickly into the distance. I whispered to myself, justice doesn't need noise. It only needs the truth to hold its ground. And as the words left my lips, I realized I didn't feel guilty for saying them. Not anymore. 2 months later, a cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment in San Diego. It looked harmless, no different from the usual stack of mail. But the words printed across the front made my stomach tighten. Summons to appear in court. State of Oregon. I sat at the table for a long time staring at it. The rain outside had softened into mist, the kind that blurred everything beyond the window. When I finally tore it open, the words were clinical, detached. Robert Monroe claims joint liability in mortgage account number 42819. My father had filed a statement saying I'd co-signed. He was still fighting to make me part of his mistake. David met me at the courthouse 2 weeks later. The building was old, all marble floors and echoing hallways. I could smell the faint mix of paper coffee and nerves. He handed me a folder. "Don't worry," he said. "They have no case. The evidence is on our side." I know I said quietly, but it's still my father. He gave me a look, half pity, half understanding. You can love someone and still need to protect yourself from them. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. My father sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched, eyes down. He looked smaller somehow, like the man who used to fill every room he entered had finally shrunk to match the truth. Mom sat behind him, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge entered, and the bailiff's voice rang out sharp and final. "All rise." When we sat, the hearing began with a dull rhythm. Motions, objections, documents entered into evidence. My father's lawyer, a gray-haired man in a wrinkled suit, spoke first. "Your Honor, my client maintains that his daughter, Ms. Claire Monroe, was aware of the refinancing and gave verbal consent." I felt my throat tighten. David rose smoothly. "Verbal consent is not a legal substitute for signature, Your Honor, nor did my client give either." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The opposing lawyer presented a printed document. My name, my supposed signature. Then David slid a thin binder across the table to the court clerk. "Forensic handwriting analysis," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle. "Conducted by the Oregon Bureau of Document Verification." The conclusion: this signature was forged. The expert took the stand. Her voice was even practiced. The curvature of the letters differs in 3 consistent ways. The pressure pattern on the pen stroke also indicates hesitation, a common trait in forged signatures. The lawyer tried to interject, but it didn't matter. The truth was too precise to argue with. When the judge asked if I wished to speak, I stood. My palms were damp, but my voice was steady. "Your Honor, I didn't sign that document. I didn't agree to the refinancing. My father asked for my help years ago, and I trusted him. I didn't know he'd used that trust to take out a loan in my name." For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. My father didn't look up. After 3 hours, the judge's ruling was short and final. The court finds that the secondary signature attributed to Ms. Monroe is falsified. Responsibility for all debt and financial obligation rests solely with Robert Monroe. The case is dismissed against Ms. Monroe. The gavel hit the wood with a sharp crack. It should have sounded like victory, but all I felt was exhaustion. My father finally looked at me. His eyes were red, his voice barely audible. "Will you be happy now?" I met his gaze. "For the first time, maybe." I didn't wait for an answer. I stepped out of the courtroom, the sound of my heels echoing against the polished floor. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky pale blue, streaked with winter sunlight. I heard someone call my name. Mom caught up to me at the steps, her breath visible in the cold. "Claire," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. For everything. For being quiet when I shouldn't have been." I nodded. "I know, Mom." She looked like she wanted to hug me, but instead she just reached out her hand, hovering for a second before falling back to her side. I gave her a small, tired smile, then turned toward the parking lot. David was waiting near his car. "You handled that perfectly," he said. "It didn't feel perfect," I replied. "Justice never does. It just feels done." He offered me a ride to the airport, but I declined. "I think I need to drive for a while." "Then drive somewhere quiet," he said. That's exactly what I did. I rented a car, packed a single bag, and left Oregon behind. The highway stretched endlessly south, lined with bare trees and patches of snow. When I crossed into Arizona, the landscape shifted, sandstone cliffs, rust-colored mesas, the horizon glowing gold under a setting sun. By late afternoon, I reached Sedona. The air there had a different kind of stillness, ancient forgiving. I pulled off onto a scenic overlook, rolled down the window, and let the wind hit my face. The radio played an old country song from the 80s, soft and melancholy. I didn't change the station. The road ahead shimmered under the light, winding through the desert like a ribbon of bronze. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like running, or proving, or explaining. I just drove, the sun falling behind me, the red cliffs catching fire with the last of the day's light. In the mirror, the reflection of my own eyes met mine, tired, but steady, no longer haunted by what I'd left behind. The past had caught up, looked me in the face, and finally let me go. The mornings in Sedona had a silence that felt almost sacred, the kind that made you speak softer without realizing it. My cabin sat on the edge of a ridge, the valley stretching below in endless shades of red and gold. When the wind moved through the pine trees, it carried the faint scent of earth and smoke, a reminder that even stillness had a heartbeat. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when I heard the soft thump outside. Mail delivery here was rare. Most days, nothing came. I stepped onto the porch and found a single envelope on the railing, the handwriting instantly familiar. Sophie's. I carried it back inside, sat at the small wooden table by the window, and opened it carefully, sliding my thumb beneath the flap like something sacred might fall out. "Claire," it began. "I understand now. Dad wasn't protecting anyone. He was protecting the version of himself he wanted everyone to believe in. Mom cries every night. She doesn't blame you. She blames herself. And I'm sorry. I didn't see it before." The next lines were shakier, written in the kind of handwriting that trembles when you've been holding too much in. "I lost my job at the cafe. The school put a hold on my classes because of tuition. I've been staying with a friend. I don't know what's next, but I wanted you to know I get it now. You weren't cruel. You were honest." I read it twice then, a third time, each word landing softer than the last. By the time I reached the end, "I hope someday we can talk again," I realized I'd been holding my breath. I folded the letter and set it next to my coffee cup, watching the steam curl above it. For the first time, my chest didn't feel heavy when I thought of home. Just distant, like a story I'd already read and finally understood. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise higher, brushing the cliffs with light. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath my bare feet. The air smelled like cedar and something sweet I couldn't name. My phone buzzed on the table inside. I hesitated before going back to check it. The message was short. "Claire, it's Mom. Your father isn't well. I'm not asking you to come. I just wanted you to know. I'm not apologizing for him anymore. I only hope you're at peace." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. The words didn't sting. They simply existed, floating in that strange place between guilt and grace. I set the phone down without replying. For a long moment, I just stood there listening to the wind move through the pines. Then I went to the bookshelf, pulled out my old black notebook, and flipped to the page I hadn't looked at in months. Mortgage, paid utilities, paid tuition, paid. All those words I'd once written like chains. I tore the page out carefully, folded it in half, and carried it to the small fire pit outside. The match hissed softly as it caught flame. The paper curled inward, the ink bleeding into smoke. I watched it burn until only a few gray edges remained. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just stops it from defining the present. I whispered the thought out loud, watching the ashes scatter in the wind. When I went back inside, the cabin felt warmer. I sat at the table again, pulled a blank sheet of paper toward me, and began to write. "Sophie, I wrote you don't owe anyone redemption but yourself. You don't have to carry what isn't yours. Just promise me one thing. Don't let anyone sign for your life again." I smiled faintly at the last line. It wasn't poetry, but it was truth. I folded the letter, sealed it, and left it by the door for the next mail pickup. Then I poured another cup of coffee and stepped back onto the porch. The valley below shimmered in sunlight, the red rocks glowing like embers. It struck me how quiet healing really was, not triumphant or cinematic, just a slow unfolding. One breath, one sunrise, one forgiven memory at a time. The breeze picked up again, brushing my hair across my face. I closed my eyes, and let it move through me, the air cool and bright, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to change or to call or to say the right words. The silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like space, wide open, and finally mine. Morning light drifted through the cabin window, soft and golden, stretching across the wooden floor like a quiet invitation. The air outside was crisp, still tinged with the cool of dawn. I could smell cedar and coffee before I even opened my eyes. For a moment, I just lay there, listening to the faint chorus of birds in the distance, the wind brushing gently against the shutters. It was the kind of silence that filled rather than emptied a room. I got up, slipped on a sweater, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The old kettle hissed as it warmed steam curling upward into the sunlight. I poured the coffee slowly, the dark liquid rippling in the mug that read, "My house, my rules." The words caught the light, simple but true. When I opened the window, a rush of cool air swept in. The valley below glowed under the early dawn, the red cliffs igniting with warmth. Somewhere far beyond the canyon, a hawk cried sharp and fleeting. I rested my elbows on the sill and breathed in the morning, unhurried, unburdened. On the table beside me, my phone lay face up. No missed calls, no voicemails, no new messages, just stillness. For months, that silence would have terrified me. It used to mean abandonment, punishment, rejection. Now it felt like space, an open field where my thoughts could finally rest without tripping over apologies. I sat at the table, the same one I'd written so many lists on before. Mortgages, deadlines, obligations. The notebook was there too, its cover worn at the corners. I flipped it open to the last page blank, except for the faint imprint of old ink. I picked up my pen and wrote slowly, letting each word settle. Silence isn't an ending, it's a beginning. I read it once, then again, and smiled. The room was still half in shadow, half in light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, turning gold when the sun touched them. I leaned back in my chair, watching how the light slid across the table, catching the rim of the coffee cup, the silver of the pen. Outside, a few dry leaves skittered across the porch, scraping lightly against the wood before the wind carried them away. The sound reminded me of old conversations, words that once cut deep, but now barely grazed the surface of memory. I thought of Dad, of the last look he'd given me in court, the hollow in his voice when he asked if I'd be happy. Maybe he was still in that small apartment, pacing the floor, still searching for someone to blame. Or maybe, finally, he was quiet too. I didn't wish him harm. I didn't wish anything, really. Just distance. Peace. Mom's last message had stayed in my mind. The way she'd said she wasn't apologizing for him anymore. I hoped that meant she'd stopped shrinking to fit around his pride. I hoped Sophie was finding her footing too, learning that forgiveness could exist without surrender. I poured a second cup of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my hands. The smell of cedar drifted in from the window, mixing with the bitter sweetness of roasted beans. It felt grounding familiar, like something worth keeping. I looked around the cabin. The simple wooden table, the shelves lined with half-read books, the small painting I'd bought from a local artist on my first day here. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every piece of it chosen, not inherited. Every corner a reflection of a life I'd built on purpose, not out of obligation. I whispered to myself, I don't need their table anymore. The words felt light, almost freeing. I have my own life now, I said softly, the sound of it blending with the wind. And I get to invite myself in. The sun climbed higher, spilling warmth across the porch. I stepped outside the boards, cool beneath my feet. The air shimmered faintly over the canyon, the light bending and glowing as the day began. I watched a single red leaf spiral through the air, caught between gusts until it disappeared into the valley below. There was no soundtrack, no grand finale, just the steady hum of the world continuing on. And maybe that was the point. Peace didn't arrive with applause. It came in moments like this. Quiet, ordinary hole. I went back inside, and sat down, pen still in hand, staring at the last sentence I'd written. The ink had already dried. I closed the notebook gently, feeling its weight, then placed it on the shelf beside the others. For years, I'd tried to keep every part of my family intact, patching over cracks that were never mine to fix. Now I understood that letting things fall apart wasn't cruelty. It was truth finally taking shape. The phone stayed silent. The world didn't demand anything from me. And for once, I didn't feel the urge to explain my absence to anyone. I picked up my mug, took one last sip, and looked out the window. The desert shimmered in the distance, alive and vast, as if waiting for me to step into it. If you've ever been the one left out of the table because you gave too much. If you've ever chosen silence just to keep your own peace. Remember this. No one can take your worth when you stop letting them define it. I smiled, set the mug down, and let the sunlight fall across my face. Tell me, have you ever stayed silent just to protect your peace? I'd love to hear your story.